but what needs to happen from that community actually comes from the agency so that there's consistent buy-in as we move forward. We also will do some of the training that you've seen over the last few days. We do want to ground people in the history of the issue, a shared language, all of the things that we've already gone through in this particular training over the week. We definitely dive into that training very intensely. And then at the end of this, we come up with a racial equity plan to move forward so that people have something in their hand that they can actually go back to time after time to be able to center racial equity in their community. This is not something you can put on a shelf after you develop it and believe that it's going to come to be after you leave. You have to lay some foundation and continue to work with it while you're there. So I think that's what I want to share in terms of our process moving forward. There's a couple of other pieces that Kavita will get to. Kavita, did you want to touch on any more on this particular slide?
I think you covered it. It's just the importance of the training, and like, you know, the hardest part about racial equity is those conversations, right? Everyone's been so reticent to say the wrong thing, or particularly usually say the wrong thing. We just like use the wrong word. I mean, I was in a group once where we were using the term Latinx, right? That's the new term. That's the one you're supposed to be using. And you know, 30 minutes in, this woman turns to me and she's like, you know, I am a Latina. That's who I am. I don't like this term Latinx. Can we just not use it? And so, you know, things, because we're working with a made up construct, right? It continues to get made up and made over and made up. And so I guess I encourage you, it's okay to say, you know, it's okay to ask the questions. It's okay to pivot. You know, we then had a conversation then with that group to say, okay, is it okay with everybody if we use this as a different term? You know, and you have to come to agreements, and you're going to have to shift depending on who's in the room, and that's okay. But it does take time and practice and an openness, and you know, you're gonna have to build up some tough skin, because things will happen. But it's important work. And the work group, we really do some additional training with. You know, we give them articles and podcasts and different things to delve into, so they can kind of practice having the conversations, so that, you know, when we start to pull out from the engagement, they can continue the work as well.
And I just wanted to touch back on something that I think is important that you kind of touched on. This is about responding to the inequality in your data. It's so important that every aspect of the training we do actually works together to give you a real picture, because sometimes the data, there's hidden messages in the data. For instance, in some of the communities that we've been in, there is in the Latinx population, I didn't know which one to use there. Sometimes the numbers are a little, the inequity is a little less. But what we find when we go through the surveys in some of those communities is there's some very distinct reasons why that happens. So the data alone doesn't tell you the whole story. Unpacking the rest of the process of assessment through those key interviews will tell you what we got from some key informants. Was there some cultural issues? There's some shared living issues. There is the inability for people from a cultural competency standpoint to have some of the materials in the language of their preference. So there are a whole lot of things that you can get from the other parts of the assessment that you don't necessarily get from the data. I just wanted to focus on that point a little bit. So I think we can go to the next slide. Kavita, I think this is yours, right?
Right. So we've done the organizational assessment, we've done the assessment of the community and impact and gathering all the data. We've done a lot of training, and then we have the plan, and once that plan is, we start implementing it, then our work becomes really doing checking in and coaching and strategy calls with the leadership and continue with the work group. And because obviously the plan has goals and outcomes and things that are being measured. And so then we just continue doing regular check-ins so that we can both look at what's happening, assess things, and then adapt them as necessary. Y'all know how to do this. I've seen what comes out of community solutions. This is kind of your sweet spot to assess and adapt. But you know, and particularly in our communities that with the coaching and the strategy, we do, like I said, we would do with the leadership team as well as the working group, and it really becomes tailored to whatever the needs of that client are. You know, some organizations have already started the work and can take off and go. I think a lot of it also depends on the collaborations that are being made in the community. None of us are working in our sectors alone, right? So your ties to the criminal justice system, your ties to the public health system, often depending on what may be going on in a parallel sector, that can always, we really encourage the organizations to partner, because so many sectors are actually taking a racial equity lens to their work. There's just some really natural partnerships that can be happening when it comes to implementation, both for training and for the implementation of your work. So we really encourage you to kind of look at your community partners, because there's some great work going on in public health in particular. People that are, you know, taking data from 20 years ago and kind of reanalyzing it with the racial equity lens and really pulling out the demographics to see, you know, wondering why it is that the outcomes aren't getting any better. And so now they've gone back and taken a racial equity lens and pulled out, you know, disaggregated the data by demographics. And you can see just such a disparate impact, but then you just have to drill down further. And a lot of that comes from discussions with community partners.
And I would just add that coaching and strategy, sometimes it's strategy with that working group, sometimes it's with the executive director. And so we continue to do that on an ongoing basis. And the whole process, we don't drag the process along when we do our work, but we know that in order to do it in a way that is comprehensive and really has the opportunity to actually be implemented, it does take some time, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 months. Some of that is our own adaptation. We, for years, have done this in person, 8-hour seminars, but we've had to adopt due to COVID to this online, as I know you have for your conference as well. So that kind of an adaptation has been a challenge for us as well. But the other couple of things that I would add is that, again, this is something that needs to really take some time and not be rushed. Because again, and I want to say this, I want to make sure that people get this. You really only have one time to do this right. If you do it and it isn't done right, then people are going to say, we tried that and it didn't work, so let's move on and do business as usual. So you really have to make this something that is really, again, comprehensive. And also, one thing that we find sometimes is that when we get to the planning stage and implementation stage, many of the groups have plans that are a lot bigger than their sphere of influence, if you will. So sometimes we have to bring people in, and that's why collaboration is so important, because much of this we can't do by ourselves in the homeless sector. So there are things that we have to do through legislation. There are things we have to do with other systems like the public housing system. So it does those people should be at the table at some point, but it also is bigger than just the homeless continuum of care and that particular group of people. So collaboration in the beginning with getting partners in and at the end is very, very important. So I think we can go to the next slide. I think we're at the end of our session of slides.
There's a question in the chat about reconciling failing forward with only having one shot at this, Donald.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I was reading more of the chats. Let me focus on this. So the question of that's making folks nervous, right? If I've only got one shot, how do I balance this tension, right? The tension to avoid, to avoid not taking any action, but then you only have one shot. Do you want to characterize the one shot piece? I mean, well, I would say it's very important to practice, and there are lots of ways to engage in these conversations before you're about to have them. So I feel like, so for example, I did this facilitation. There's this documentary series called America to Me. It's set in Chicago. It's in a big public high school there that on the surface is very diverse. It has, plenty of Black and brown kids there, plenty of white. It's very mixed. But then when you go into the classrooms, the kids are clearly being tracked, and all the AP classes have mostly white kids, and all the Black and brown kids have been relegated to the general ed. And so it's this 10-part documentary series, and they have all these facilitated discussions so you can actually watch them throw watch parties and watch them together in a community, and then initiate these dialogues around race. And so even with the guide, I mean, it has all the talking points. It's all very well laid out, so anybody can kind of pick up and do it. But I was so nervous to do this at my son's school. I went and found another school that was doing it in their community, and said, "Would you mind if I sit in?" And then I spent 2 evenings going to their sessions where I could sit there, soak it up, see kind of what the dialogue is, and it really made me much more comfortable before stepping in. So I just think it's much more about preparation before you implement that conversation and engage with your own community.
So when I talk about a failure, I don't think you can fail at this work once you start it. What I mean by failure is if it's a one-off. If you do some assessment, you do some planning, and that's it, and it sits on a shelf somewhere. But if you do the work right, and what I mean by doing the work right is implementing a long-term solution to this issue by creating a group of people that are going to continuously assess the issue and look at your progress. And the way to do that is to take the time to really get it right. So implementing that work group that has the responsibility to continuously look at this work. And then if there is a need to dive back in, that group is available. So rushing would be not implementing a group of people that can do that work, and all the work that you've done over 5 or 6 months just ends at that point. So when I'm talking about failure, I'm talking about not putting into place, putting in some sustainable processes to continue the work after you finish. After we leave, the work stops. But our goal, and this would be a failure on our part, is to not put in place a sustainable system to continue to make sure that racial equity is centered in your community. So I hope that kind of explains it a little better, what I was trying to say there. But I just caution people to really take the time to do it right. I don't think you can be a failure in this. You are failing forward if you even start the process. Because it's a process that's 400 years overdue.
Thank you both so much for that. Again, listening, I could listen to Kavita and Donald all day long talk about these things, as well as their other partner, Jeff Olivet, who honestly came to Phoenix like a few years ago. And ever since then, I've just been fangirling about a lot of these folks. So thank you so much for sharing your input with us and your insight and just being with us on this journey as well. I think we're going to have a little bit more time towards the end of our session for more questions. And we're also just going to make sure that you've got a way to contact them in the event that you want to talk to them some more. So with that being said, I'm super excited to get to this piece. So if you're not awake yet, I need you to be awake and with us and together. About in 20 seconds or so, you're going to need to take yourself off mute so you can interact with your folks. So again, we talked about this. We're going to put you all into some breakout rooms. We're going to take a little bit of time to kind of practice the work as it would be in the assessment phase. So in a second, we will put you into breakout rooms. Please accept that prompt when it populates on your screen. During this breakout, we'll provide you with data reflective of the race inequities. We've created a couple of questions for you and your group members to review. To review the data, you can grab the data from the slide deck available through Schedule. And again, just to reiterate, finding those materials and pulling up those breakout room session questions and looking at the data itself. We're going to give you about 20 minutes to do this with the group members in your room, and some of us are just going to be popping in and out, just kind of helping you along in this conversation. But I hope that you find these next 20 minutes to be really helpful to kind of start looking at it, because earlier in the chat, I noticed that some folks said that they hadn't even begun some of these conversations. They haven't even begun this work yet. So this can just give you that insight into what it might look like. Again, this is not an if situation, this is a when situation. So enjoy, see you in 20 minutes. And I believe Ashley is going to put you in breakout rooms in a couple seconds. Yeah, okay.
Breakout rooms are open.
Awesome, so hopefully we've got you all back right about now. We kind of just wanted to bring you back and kind of do a little bit of a debrief and just ask some questions like, what did you see in your data? So for example, for that population data, like what did you notice? Who was overrepresented and who was underrepresented? And feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or if you'd like to chat that into the box. I'm really interested what some of you all saw and talked about in your breakout groups.
Hi, this is Stephanie from Phoenix, Arizona. One thing that we noticed on the destinations was that, I don't know if you could flip to that slide, was that the white households had 7% were going to transitional housing. I know that in Maricopa County that folks who are in bridge housing, transitional housing before transitioning to permanent have better outcomes. So we just thought, we were just looking at that and thinking like, is the access to transitional housing better for white folks? And then, you know, their housing outcome is better as well. Like why is nobody else accessing the transitional housing?
That's a really good observation. Shout out to the home team in Phoenix for looking at that and thinking about that. What else did folks see? Whether it was in the prior living situations, exit destinations, the length of time experiencing homeless, or the length of time to housing?
This is Brian from Denver. One of the things that we talked about that felt it was hard to look at some of the data is we didn't know the numbers that we were looking at. And when you start looking at when we usually look like Asian population, or we look at Native American population, if there's only 4 or 5 people that are in the data and 2, one in each category, it kind of skews the data for representation because there's so little folks that are there. Or, how many are we talking about that were white, or how many are we talking about that were Black alone? And so without having those actual numbers, it was, as we looked at it, we didn't know what we were actually comparing in some places. That's
really, really great. There's also some folks in the chat. I just want to read it out loud. So Matt said it was interesting to see the prior living situations too, specifically the breakdowns on who was or were not engaging with emergency shelters. And then we had Carrie said a couple of us had never thought of running prior living situations data, and they're just really excited to potentially look at that for themselves. And Annie was asking a great question, which I think is also really great. Are any theories on why no American Native or the Alaskan Native populations have no exits into institutions? Why that would be happening, or what could that tell you about your community? Anyone wants to try and take a poke at that?
This is Jason Munoz with in Fairfax, Virginia.
Hi, Jason.
We did. I'm not going to necessarily try to answer that, but we did kind of touch on that a little bit in the sense that we did see that, for instance, when we looked at prior living for, trying to get to the graph here. Sorry, the prior living or prior, for a Caucasian, and then say in contrast to African American, we saw like the we looked at the transitional and in the institutional. We noticed, for instance, like with African Americans at the prior part, you know, it looked like it got cut in half from prior to their exit destination in terms of how many were in transitional. And then the number, of course, being higher at 62 when they exited. But with the institution, we were wondering what exactly also those institutions were. Were they mental health? Were those jails? Also, were those maybe detention, like in terms of ICE? Because we looked at how that was really glaring for the African American population, also the Hispanic population in terms of the institutions, pretty much being kind of similar from when they were prior and then, you know, after the fact. But you see that bump for the Hispanic population from 7% to 11%. So we did see that for the other groups as well. Just had some questions about what kind of institutions those were.
I think that's a very valid point. Yeah, and I think that there are some other folks that were kind of thinking the same thing from what I'm seeing in the chat, but I also frame it as this. For most of our HMIS systems, when we're talking about exit destinations, there's a difference between like jail or prison versus an institution as an actual destination. So yes, we didn't necessarily specify it in this, but if you also reflect back to earlier, what Kavita was saying is that in terms of what does it look like for your community? And when you're talking about Black and Brown communities, you also have to start thinking about like the criminal justice involvement. What does that look like? Are there folks overrepresented in that area, which then will trickle over into this homeless data? Or do you see other disparities that might be coming from like education, economic data, institutional data? When you're thinking about Hispanic or Latinx families, culturally speaking, you might see them going to live with family or friends permanently rather than temporarily, because we know that that's part of a culture of just being very much close together, being with your family all the time. So thinking about these different cultural aspects, but also what's going on in your community as it pertains to your data can be very, very telling. And I'm just looking at some of the chatter that's happening in the chat box, which I think is really, really amazing. I'm loving seeing all of this. So what we're to think of a little bit further, we're wondering, we had additional questions for you. So when you're thinking about it a little bit further, thinking about the location prior to project entry, what factors might contribute to why some populations are overrepresented versus those who aren't? And again, feel free to use the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, we love that too.
In our group, we talked about people running programs and leadership and what those folks look like and
Mhm.
how that could be trickling down and impacting programs.
Right, right. I believe it was in a session yesterday where one of our presenters talked about physically watching someone who was not a person of color being that entry point as the case manager, welcoming some of the clients in and watching her interact with clients that looked like her versus those that didn't look like her, as she was not a person of color, and how much that changed things. And I think that that definitely plays into the scenario that you just said just now as well, Abby. Thank you for sharing that. A lot of really good thoughts on this. So then here's another question, like in your own community, how do you sync data into the, or how do you sync into the data presented when thinking of your own community? Like how, I don't like to use the word triggered because sometimes that could have a negative connotation, and I don't want it to necessarily have that, but it just makes me wonder, how do you think that this plays into your own community? What kind of nuances or things do you see as they currently exist?
It's making, this is Kaylee from Kansas City. It's really making me want to look into the data on people that are being exited back into homelessness or emergency shelter. And it's making me want, we're just now getting to a point where we're getting into HMIS, thank God. So I'm curious, once we are in there and can start to run this data, what that's going to look like.
Wonderful. I'm really curious too. So when y'all find that out, let me know, okay? Cool. Anyone else would like to share? We've got Kate from New Mexico saying, I want to see which populations are being inactivated or not having contact made. Interesting. That's a great, great question. And Kavita has just pointed out that redlining still exists and continues in bias of realtors as well. Midori is saying how to provide guidance to community partners who aren't required to answer to the COC. That's the question I keep chewing on. And I think that that's a very valid question that a lot of communities are still working on for those providers who really aren't connected to the COC or aren't required to be connected. Abby had a great suggestion of figuring out who their funders are and seeing if you could kind of utilize that angle. All really great insights and input, y'all. So then with the last 15 minutes of our session, I would like to review some reflections and next steps, but then also encourage you all, probably end a couple minutes early, to encourage you all to go to the survey and take our brief survey. Again, you've heard us say this time and time again, like we want to be better and do better, and we need to know what y'all think of this session and the conversations that we've had. So again, with reflections and next steps, like what are some key takeaways do you feel that you're all taking with you when you go back to your communities? What are some next steps that you think, and it could be the most simple thing. It could be your next step is sitting down with your higher ups and saying, we need to start looking at this. It could be, I want to go to my HMIS team and pull this specific data just so I can see where the disparities lie. Bobbin is saying that they need to revisit the length of time intersection with race. That's a great place to start for sure. And I remember some of you were stating earlier that these aren't even necessarily conversations that have begun in your community. Through your COC, you haven't yet looked at the data or even considered getting like an evaluation of some sort. So maybe that's something that would be your next step, is that you go back and talk to your community and start pulling your data and start entering in that conversation of maybe we should have an assessment completed. have some outside help to be able to show us like what we haven't seen or cannot yet see. Haley's saying that they're putting their data in HMIS now, so their first step will be to run a report once everyone on their BNL is inside HMIS.
And Shantae, I would just add that most of this data already exists.
Right.
People have to present the data to HUD. So you have to do your AHAR, you have to do point in time counts. So there's a lot of that data that's already existing in the community. And I would just add that every piece of this data tells a story. And also, it's very important that people look at every entry point in the system to really find out what that story is. So for the destinations, for where people come from, sometimes that has to do with who's doing the outreach, and sometimes that has to do with who's doing the intake. So every entry point in the system, the data directs you to what could be an issue in that particular area, or places where there needs to be some work. But I will say that the data does already exist. If you're getting money from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. You can absolutely get back today and talk to your data folks about looking at that data in your community.
Abby, I appreciate your comment in the chat to saying, like, yes, you look at your access to coordinated entry for referred to programs and exit destinations, but you're open to analyzing more points in the process. And I think that that brings us back to the point that Kavita said earlier of just being open in general and having pure openness in this entire process to look at how we're doing, what we're doing, and what we can do better. Yeah, Abby, if you don't mind taking yourself off mute for one moment, I'm really interested in your last point in the chat box, if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more.
Sure. So this is something our community's really been wrestling with. We've been doing equity analyses of our coordinated entry system, which we started in 2005 in HMIS. So we have the data to be looking at. We've looked at it. We see that there are differences, but we have no idea why those differences exist. So in the example with this data, why you saw really low to no rates of the American Indian Alaska Native population in shelters. And so if you don't know why someone's not utilizing a resource or is exiting to, non-positive destinations at higher rates, then I don't know what to, it's hard to figure out what action to take, because what we've done as our community is not invested the time and money into getting the qualitative data that I think really needs to come next. And so as a result, we've been making these moves that I don't have any idea whether they're grounded in anything or whether they're going to change anything or whether we're spinning our wheels on a section that isn't appropriate. So for example, our data shows that African American population is overrepresented based on poverty. And some folks in our community have patted themselves on the back about that, like, oh, so we're appropriately reaching this population, where I don't know that that is actually true. So that's sort of what I'm trying to think through next.
Yes, I think that that's really great. But I also wonder, do you have folks in your community that would be considered persons with lived experience, and what kind of role do they play in some of this decision making or this data diving?
Yeah, we have 2 seats on our COC steering committee, paid seats for people with lived experience, and we were a Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project recipient. So we have a super active, engaged youth action board. Well, I think we need way more work. That's not enough people, like 12 people in a whole county to help ground the work. And really, our county is so overwhelmingly white, which I talked about in our group, that to pull together focus groups of particular populations of communities of color is really challenging and takes a lot of work. And I think that's why it hasn't been done well historically.
Interesting. I think someone else was about to speak.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Abby, I mean, that's just across sectors. Like this work, like as Donald said before, like it's so important. Like you said, you don't know why something's happening to a particular group, and yet it's like, well, the best way to find out is to talk to that group, right? To talk to the person who's experiencing it and ask those questions. And time again in our programs, we're sitting around tables designing things without, you know, what is that quote? Something like the people closest to the problem or the furthest away from creating the solutions, right? We don't have them around the table, and it's ridiculous. We're like making up stuff about what we think when you could actually go get it. But you're right. And why it hasn't been done, because it does take time and continued practice, and it can't be just in response to kind of the next yes and furthest from the power. Exactly. But I mean, this is when you're looking at this data, and it's so apparent that people are being impacted so differently. You know, we've got to invest the resources in the right places to make sure that otherwise we're not going to solve the problem. It's just we're never going to get to the end of housing everybody who needs a home if we can't really get at what the root of the problem is.
And if I jump in really quick, I think you answered your question also, Abby. I think one of the things that you pointed out is that you have a pretty active YHDP. And what we find in our data, for the most part, and of course, no community is exactly the same, but in those predominantly white communities that we've been in, and we are in a couple that are 80+%, what we do find is in the youth homelessness, especially with the parents, it's overwhelmingly people of color. And what also I would say is that those YHDP groups are phenomenal when it comes to key focus group information. So I think that that is a really good place to start. And don't be discouraged if you can't find tons of people. Just start with the people you have. And I think you'll get a really good understanding of kind of what those limitations are and why people aren't utilizing the system. As I say, it's a treasure trove of information. And then you also activate people to be even more in the system in terms of work and participation, because checking off a box with 2 people on the board is what happens in a lot of communities, but true involvement does, as Kavita said, takes a great deal of work. So I would encourage you to look at the people that you already have and then build on that.
Agreed. Thank you so much, both of you, for that input.
And this is also another, I'm sorry, Shantae, it's just like another place for collaboration too, right? We can't necessarily run, you know, if it's resources, you can't run a focus group every time. There's, you know, looking for those other community-based groups that are perhaps already working with the population. I mean, I'm lucky to be in New York City where there's a group for everything, but, you know, I'm sure in your communities, there are groups perhaps already working with that population through which you could make a connection, so that it's not always you setting up something. You can tag on to perhaps something they're already doing and when they bring their community together.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And yes, Bobbin, exactly. Before we let you go, I'm going to let it stay open for another minute or two for any questions that you might have for myself or Donald or Kavita. If not, please take the evaluation for this session. Again, utilize your phone to capture that QRL code. I believe we can also put it in the chat for you all in the event that you're not able to pull it up. We also We'll have the contact information for Donald and Kavita available. Thank you, KO, for putting that. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining with us today. We really, really appreciate you and all of your participation, not only here in this session, but also in your work, in your communities, in this everyday struggle and fight we have together. So just keep fighting that good fight, and we'll see you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.